Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is Tuesday, October 11th, 2022. Tonight's topic is titled Changing Seasons, Learning to Let Go of Old Ideas, Relationships, and Contexts. And this is one of those subjects that I'm very excited to talk about. I think because there are some topics that I teach and talk about on this broadcast that are for parents, that are for parents of our program, and maybe giving somebody some of the base information, the foundational information that I think people need to learn in this process as we go through the process of enlightenment and awakening and living a healthier, more authentic life. But tonight's topic is something that's near and dear to my heart every day. I can remember sitting in therapy some years ago and talking to my therapist and having that realization. It was before I wrote the Audacity to Be You, and thinking to myself, either a new relationship or a relationship had just previously ended, or a new idea had replaced an old idea. And I said to her, it seems as though life is a series of goodbyes to these old ideas, to these old relationships. And her kind of affirming that that's part of growth, that for new growth, there has to be death. There has to be something that gives way for that new thing to be born, to sprout up, to flower, to blossom, to catch fire. So I think about this a lot. I think about the idea that if I'm the same person I was 5 years ago, or I'm the same person I will be 5 years from now, if I'm the same person 5 years from now that I am today, that essentially I've wasted 5 years of my life. So this idea is near and dear to me. The other thing that comes to mind is the changing of seasons. I grew up in Southern California. Some of you might know that. I grew up in Orange County, California, and essentially we had no seasons. As a young person, I absolutely loved that. I loved visiting the snow and the cold weather states, but anytime I spent an extended period of time in those places, those states, I really dreaded the discomfort of it, the inconvenience of it, sometimes the mess of it. In Southern California and Orange County, of course, growing up was sunny most every day of the year. We wore shorts and flip flops and t-shirts to high school in the middle of what other people were experiencing as winter often. But one thing I've begun to appreciate after living in Utah for more than a couple of decades now is that there's something about the changing seasons that makes me appreciate each season as it passes with more presence, more awareness, more of a kind of mindfulness. Just this weekend, I had the opportunity to participate in a memorial for my mother-in-law who passed away about a year ago, just over a year ago, and we haven't had time as a family to gather together, so we gathered for that. And again, it's constantly reminding me of this idea that life is a series of goodbyes. When I've lost pets, life is a series of goodbyes, and what that teaches us, what that teaches me, what that reminds me, I should say, is that today is precious. The time that we have now is very precious. And that kind of mindfulness, that kind of presence is in essence parallel to therapy, to psychology. I often tell our clients that therapy is kind of like a mindfulness practice. The therapist sits with you and listens a great deal if they're a good therapist. Asks you questions like, how do you feel? What did you think? How did you react? How did that strike you? How did that affect you? In essence, they're asking you to talk your way through your own body, your own feelings, your own thoughts, your own ideas. So it's an invitation or a practice in mindfulness. So I found this proverb today that said, "Death is the middle of a long life." And I love that idea to start off with that quote. This idea that if we do this life well, we will die not just one time, although midlife crisis is symbolically a significant death or transition into a new sensibility, a new way of living, but hopefully we'll die throughout our life over and over again. One of the things we learned from Joseph Campbell's work in his study of mythology is that in our mythology and our myths, that the event of death is often a symbolic moment of letting go of old aspects of ourselves. And so tonight I'm going to be talking about enlightenment a lot. I'm going to use that word a lot. And really, what I'm talking about when I use the word enlightenment is coming to consciousness, coming to awareness, becoming aware of who we are, what we feel, what is the essence. That doesn't mean enlightenment doesn't mean improving necessarily, getting better necessarily, becoming gooder, better, right? Great and wonderful. It in essence is becoming aware and at peace and embracing who we are. And I'll take a couple of moments to go from there. In The Audacity to Be You, if you've read the book, I close out the book with a list of, I think, 12 or 13 myths and 3 keys to enlightenment. And I'll read them here, and we're going to be focusing on the third one today. I wrote that key one is that we learn to be okay with being wrong and get really good at losing. I remember I showed that to a professional athlete, a professional multi-year all-star player. And he said to me when he saw it, this isn't going to work for me. I already know that your philosophy is too different for me. That's not the way that I live my life. And I asked him, I said, do you have are you willing to have a conversation where I will show you that you already believe this? And he says, sure. And I said, what would you say to a pitcher on your baseball team who just threw a pitch that was a mistake and it was hit out of the park for a home run or a grand slam? What would you say to that person? And he said, I would tell him to forget about it, to put it behind him. There's an adage in athletics that the greatest athletes have very short memories. And I explained to him that's what it means to lose well. You learn to let go. You learn to hold on tightly and let go of your mistakes, your old ideas, even your old successes. Key 2, I wrote, is come to know your darkness and remain on speaking terms with your mental illness. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in the context of letting go and moving on and letting old context, relationships, and ideas go. But in essence, it's learning to embrace who you are, learning to embrace your symptoms, learning to embrace. I was talking to a management company today about some of the work that we're doing. And I was trying to explain to them this concept. It's hard to say it more simply, but in essence, the kind of psychotherapy we do here at Evoke isn't about behavior change, although behavior change happens. It isn't about reducing symptoms, although symptoms are reduced. It isn't about getting rid of our pathology, although pathology tends to alleviate in this process. It's about leaning into our woundedness, leaning into our pathology, leaning into our symptoms, and following those symptoms, those issues where they might lead, which if we do so patiently with an awareness, they will bring us to a place that we need to attend to that we need healing. So it's very important to constantly remind clients, to constantly remind our therapist, to constantly remind myself that to help people move through their life, we have to find out and go with the resistance, go with the defense, go with the symptom instead of fight against it. In fact, most people's pathology, most people's mental illness is in this way caused by their attempt not to be mentally ill, not to be sick, not to have symptoms. And that just causes more problems. But the bulk of what I'm going to be talking about today is the one that I list as key number 3. Learn how to die again and again. Let go of old contexts, beliefs, and relationships. And that's what tonight's broadcast is about. It's about how we need to let go. This idea of enlightenment is getting rid of old ideas, and specifically a couple of ideas that are really, really critical in letting go of our ideas. As I talk about this at the outset, I just want to acknowledge that this is something that one has to revisit throughout their life. This is something that you don't arrive at, that you don't conclude. And that part of it is just accepting. Once somebody said to me so many years ago when I was running an intensive, one of the individuals said to me, I think I wrote about this somewhere. He said, there was a point when I was listening to you. I hear this so often. I couldn't quite understand what you're saying. It didn't quite land or make sense to me. But after some months of listening or rereading the book again, I'm always amazed that people keep listening or keep reading if it doesn't make sense to them. But maybe there's some glimmer coming through for them. But they'll say to me, and this gentleman said to me, once it clicked for me, once I heard it, once I saw it, once I felt it, everything made sense after that. And at that, I just want to reemphasize what I've said many times. This is not my philosophy. This is not my unique approach. This is an approach that many have shared. In fact, I would argue that most of the enlightened ones on earth have followed this path that we'll be talking about today. I want to share this story from a friend. I had a friend call me just last evening and share with me about they had finally heard, making reference to Joseph Campbell's idea of the call to adventure. They'd finally heard the call to adventure. They'd finally heard the music that their soul was playing, and that they were going to follow that. They were going to make some really big changes in their life. In fact, in one case, he told me, I've been waiting for my whole life to find a wife after an early divorce. I've been waiting for my whole life to find a wife, to find children, to find my people, my tribe. I'd spent my life keeping score about who was in my life and who wasn't out of my life and why. And really, what I need to do is I need to spend some time, an extended period of time, a long time with myself until I can become self sufficient, until I'm okay with myself. And I was so impressed with that shift. You see, the thing that he thought was the problem was not the problem. It was what he was thinking about life that was the problem. He was thinking that the answer is in finding a wife or a partner for him or children, and not being happy where he was at now. As he told me this, and I was effusive with my praise and acknowledgement, and I've known this friend for 25, 30 years. I said to him, that's amazing. That sounds like you've been in therapy for 10 years, and that you finally come to this. And he said, I just figured it out during a piece of mindfulness during one of my favorite activities. I realized this. And we celebrated that for a while. And then there was a pause and a change of subject. And he said to me, changing the subject, he said, sometimes I overthink things. And I said, let's just pause there, because everything up to this point has been really, really wise and enlightened. But I think that's some of the old language, what my wife likes to call the mother tongue. I think that's some of the old context getting to you. Instead of thinking, I overthink, maybe ask yourself why you overthink, why you find it necessary to ruminate and think and plan and rehearse things. And if we follow that, I think what we'll find is some kind of trauma where you felt out of control. You felt powerless and helpless and shocked and surprised and blindsided. And so probably, I didn't go into this much detail, but essentially what I taught him was, if we follow this overthinking problem that you think that you have, and we follow it to its root, I think we'll find a trauma that needs to breathe, that needs some air, that needs to be addressed, that needs to be grieved. So the very essence, I want you to hear this, the very essence of our work is to find the way. And in Taoism, it's called the Tao. Find the way that life is working. What is? You're going to lose people. I said to a friend recently who wanted to buy a dog, I said, the hardest part about buying a dog for me, and I always have a dog during, at least one dog during my adult life. The hardest part about having a dog is the minute that I buy a dog, if everything goes well at this point in my life, the dog will die before me. I'm literally signing up to lose this creature that will give me comfort and companionship and that I love. James Hollis writes, the only requisite to entry into the middle passage, that stage of what he would describe, what he would agree is kind of a death of the old self and the rebirth of a new self. Think midlife crisis. Carl Jung called it the second half of life. The only prerequisite, Hollis writes, to entry into the middle passage is to have discovered that one does not know who one is, that there are no rescuers, no mommy or daddy, that there's one's fellow travelers who would do well to survive themselves. So part of what we have to embrace is failure, the very thing that we were taught to avoid. I said this to my friend, I said this to my children in a different conversation this weekend. The idea that we can win and come out on top of all of this sets all of us up for failure. I think that's why having children is so valuable of a lesson for us in life, because it's the thing that for most of us will be the most important thing that we experience in our lives, that role of a parent. And it's the one thing that we care about, that we value that much, and we are absolutely sure to fail at it. So to embrace this idea, of losing, of failure, of not knowing, of becoming undone. I tell this, I remind people that in Brene Brown, the TED talk that made her famous, the one on shame, the first one that came out that by this point I'm sure has tens of millions of views. She says that she was going through what she called a midlife crisis or a nervous breakdown, I think is what she specifically called it. And she said her therapist called it an awakening, a spiritual rebirth. Sigmund Freud said if you want somebody to grow, set them up with a task that they are sure to fail at. His protege Carl Jung used to say to clients who came in with a new promotion or that they were engaged, he would somberly say, sit them down and say, if we talk this through, if we bond together and pool our resources together, we'll make it through this. But on the other hand, if they had a success, they got a breakup, got fired from a job, had some dramatic loss in their life, Jung would symbolically say, let's open up a glass of champagne and celebrate. It's that's the problem. And where did we learn that? Where did we learn that failure, that pain, that death was to be avoided at all costs? We learned that from our context, from our parents. There's a little bit that's part of our genetics, right? That we don't want to, we're averse to pain. We're averse, we have an instinct to survive, to live, to not die. Part of it's in there, but it became misguided at some point. And instead, we can learn. We can learn with psychotherapy and with a practice to embrace those things that terrified us. So why doesn't everybody become enlightened? Why doesn't everybody go through this process of letting go of the old and welcoming in the new? And essentially, it's because of these experiences with that fear. We're afraid of all sorts of things. We're afraid that we won't survive it, that it will overwhelm us. We're afraid of guilt, right? We're averse to guilt. We have a misguided sense of loyalty to people. I was just thinking about this as I was preparing for this evening, about the idea that I constantly talk about, that if my children said to me that we need to feel better, I need to not be around you anymore, Dad. If that was something that one of my children arrived at that conclusion in adulthood, and I've said on this broadcast many times, I would support them 100 times out of 100, but there would be a grief there. But in essence, what I'm saying to them is, when something doesn't serve you in your life, when something doesn't touch and feed the fire in your soul, even if it's me, it's important that you let it go. Fear, guilt, shame, that feeling of wanting to hide and disappear because I'm unacceptable, powerlessness, helplessness, confusion, can be disoriented, feeling, like I said before, overwhelmed, fear of rejection or being alone. If I take this path, individuals and couples say it all the time. If I come to therapy, if I do my work, I'm afraid that I will move farther and farther apart from my father, or from my spouse, or from my family of origin, from my community. Joseph Campbell says there are these thresholds that we have to cross to learn what we have to learn. And we are convinced that crossing these thresholds will lead to utter emotional annihilation, rejection, loneliness, what have you. And he goes so far to say, we see symbolically at the base of the threshold other people who have died trying to cross this threshold. I love this quote. Everything you've ever wanted is sitting on the other side of fear. To grow, we have to develop our muscle of courage. And as you all know, courage is not doing things that aren't afraid, that don't cause fear. That's just doing something that's easy. Courage is feeling fear and doing it scared. Being able to take the new information, the new knowledge, the new consciousness, the new awareness, the new tool, and doing it scared. Like I've said many times, I fantasized during the first half of my life that therapy would take away all of my fear, and it doesn't, and it hasn't. Not even close. But what it's done is it's giving me the reassurance that I can do it scared. And in essence, mom and dad, if you're a mom and dad that's listening, and much of my audience is. In essence, you have to realize that this is home, and I'm pointing to myself. And when you become your own home, when you become your own home, you don't need to fear anymore. My friend that I was telling you about, who thought that the solution was finding a wife and finding a family, and said that he needed to be more self-sufficient, I explained to him that's the exact quality that needs to be nurtured and developed in a couple, in a marriage, for that marriage to be successful. I have to work on self sufficiency within my marriage, as does my wife. If we don't, then anything that triggers our fear of being left or rejected will result in either a fight or a flight response. Right? I will attack. I will lash out to get my needs met, or I will retreat and run away because I don't want to feel that. And that's why I say, if you're considering divorce or marriage for that matter, the work is the same. The work is the same if you're the parent of a 13-year-old child that's on the autism spectrum. The work is the same if you have a 23-year-old person's child that's struggling with substance use disorder. The work is the same if your partner isn't supportive of the process. The work is the same if you're here listening, watching this broadcast, or listening to this broadcast because you're having a difficult decision in life, or something that you're getting through. The work is always reconnecting to yourself, to find, to develop that sense that wherever I am, that's where home is. That's a safe place to be. The other day on our trip, my wife was teasing me. We were at the counter getting our rental car for our trip after landing. And at one point, I was teasing her, and we were going back and forth. And she said, "If you don't knock it off, I'm going to walk away, and the rest of us are just going to leave and leave you on your own." I'm a very stress-driven traveler, by the way. So my family both has felt it, and also in some ways adopted it themselves. So my wife was teasing me and saying, "If you don't get it together, we're all going to walk away and just have this vacation without you." And I said to her, I said, when I was younger, that might have been a good threat. But now you understand that part of what fuels me is being alone. Part of what resets my nervous system is being alone, going to a movie, going to a Broadway show alone, sitting in a hotel in Toronto, Canada, on a business trip by myself for a few hours in the evening. And we kept teasing back and forth. But what I was trying to communicate was, I've developed this greater comfort, more comfort with being alone. And that development of a characteristic in me has made me a better partner, more available to intimacy. You can only be available to intimacy to the extent that you become comfortable with being alone. Alan Watts taught that when you find out that there was never anything in the dark side to be afraid of, nothing is left but love. All the things that you were told that you would be, selfish, inconsiderate, uncaring, oversensitive, whatever you were told that you would be, to take this new path that's inviting you, that's welcoming you, that's beckoning to you. Once you get rid of that once you overcome that fear, once you face it and conquer that dragon, as Joseph Campbell talks about, all that's left is love, because you've conquered, in essence, ego. Because the ego needs you to be good, a good father, a good mother. I'm watching right now. I don't know if all of you are watching it, but it's pretty popular. Steve Carell is starring in a series right now on Hulu called The Patient, where a serial killer patient kidnaps his therapist and tries to force him to do therapy on him. And there's scenes where Steve Carell's in a trance state, going back and visiting his therapist as a client while he's locked up in this basement day after day after day, living with this serial killer who, of course, is threatening his life. And he's having an exchange with his therapist. It happens in a short period of time. If you haven't seen the latest episode, I'm about to spoil it, just so you know. You can fast forward another 30 seconds. But he comes to the realization that his job wasn't his child's job to take care of him and to support him, that he was the one that realized that he had fallen short of loving his son, his adult son. And that what he had perceived as rejection from his son to him was really precipitated by his own rejection and judgment of his son, who'd become Orthodox Jewish, and he was a modern Jewish man. So once we overcome this, we're filled with love, with the capacity to love. Dr. Glenn Patrick Doyle writes, ironically, when we start to get better, we also often get sad because we start to realize how much we've missed out on, how badly certain people failed us, what the younger version of ourselves actually deserved. Healing involves healthy grieving, no way around it. Part of what you have to let go of is the idealized version of your childhood that you hold in your head. That is there, the idealized part of it is there in part to support your parents' need to be good parents. And I know that might not resonate consciously with you. And that's why I have the joke that I often tell, that if you tell me that you have a good childhood, I will tell you that therapy can fix that. That's my playful way of saying we have to look at our childhood critically. We have to unwind the trauma, small or big trauma that we experienced in our life. We have to know how we were dented and bruised in our childhood in order to be free of it. Not to stay stuck, not to, as we've been warned, develop a victim's mentality, but really to become the hero of our own life and go back into the basement, go back into the belly, go back into the dark forest, go back into that terrifying place and face what was and feel what was unfelt and see what we were told not to see and told didn't exist. One of my very favorite quotes about enlightenment is this: enlightenment is a destructive process. It has nothing to do with becoming better or being happier. Enlightenment is the crumbling away of untruth. It's seeing through the facade of pretense. It's the complete eradication of everything we imagine to be true. I think my role in these broadcasts and in the books that I write and in the individual therapy or the intensives that I run is to invite people to this place. This place of unlearning. In a lot of ways, I'm not the first person who said this. What I really teach and do is I teach things to people that they already know. Not things that they don't know, but things that they've been told not to believe or have forgotten. Things that they've been conditioned not to feel by their context. For example, mom and dad were good. That's of course not true. It's never true. Mom and dad are whole, which means they are good and bad. They are smart and dumb. They are generous and stingy. They are creative and rigid, right? They're human, in other words. So we have to let go of the idea that mom and dad are good. And in one way, in one perspective, pathology is fueled by this one idea in families, and that is to support the idea that mom and dad are good. And once the child overcomes that idea, and even better, once the parent overcomes that idea, everybody's free to love, to feel, to embrace what is. I told the story earlier about the gentleman in the intensive that had this awareness. He said to me, once I realized that one of my core beliefs wasn't true, one of the things I'd believed my entire life that kept me feeling safe. You hear that? That kept me feeling safe and secure. Once I realized that it wasn't true, I was terrified to realize immediately that everything was up for grabs. If you're the same person 10 or 20 years from now that you are today, you've wasted 10 or 20 years. Carl Jung has a very famous quote about this death and rebirth and letting go. He says, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The latter procedure, however, is disagreeable and therefore not popular. That's a really important thing. The things that we were taught to be afraid of, the darkness. are actually where the liberation is found. I, there are a lot of wise teachers who have spent time and walked among the downtrodden, right? The poor, the uneducated, the sinners, the misfits, the outcasts. It's not one religion I'm talking about. I'm talking about most of them. And they're able to do that because they can connect to those folks because they're connected to all of themselves. It's why Carl Jung said the best way of dealing with somebody else's darkness is to understand your own. If you want to understand your child's or your spouse's or your parents or your uncles or your brothers or your sisters' substance use disorder, understand your own addictive tendencies. Understand your own self-medicating behaviors. If you want to understand somebody that you care about, understand yourself. Get in touch with the parts of yourself that you've been told to ignore or to get rid of, or you've been told were unacceptable. Hollis says, but such is the first adulthood, full of blunders, shyness, inhibitions, mistaken assumptions, and always the silent rolling of tapes of childhood. If one had not set forth and made those mistakes and crashed into those walls, then one would have remained a child. Reviewing one's life from this vantage point of the second half requires understanding and forgiveness of the inevitable crime of unconsciousness. What a beautiful, beautiful quote. We start when we embrace wholeness instead of goodness. Like Jung said, I would rather be whole than good. When we understand that progress is better than perfection, that the journey is more important than the destination, that the direction on the path is more important than where you are on the path. When we start to understand those things, we see mistakes, setbacks, and detours in a whole different light. We understand that sometimes the best way forward is through a mistake because it teaches you something you may not know any other way. And when we start changing our relationship to our mistakes, we think about our children's mistakes differently. And then we come to the awareness of something I've been teaching lately, which is once you realize that your child is your teacher, not the other way around, everything changes immediately. Seen in that light, you don't have to practice patience. It just comes to you automatically. I read a quote in preparation of this tonight that talks about this idea that once we understand that the child is coming with the lessons that we need for life, we automatically reduce in our anger and our sadness and our grief and our frustration. I often say to parents, I said it 2 weeks ago when I was speaking in Toronto, I said, if just for a few hours, just for this presentation tonight, if you can just practice believing that where you are and folks that are listening to me, that you're not off track, that this is not some detour. This is not some place you shouldn't be, but it's actually part of the journey. One great teacher said, and I read this after I wrote it in my book, that once we answer correctly the question of who am I, which is I'm a student, even in the role of a parent, especially in the role of a therapist, once we answer correctly the question of who am I, all the other questions become clear, especially the questions of what should I do? Because once we know who we are, what we do just comes out of that. I wanted to share this next quote, this next principle. I truly love this quote. It says, seek not the paths of the ancients, seek that which the ancients sought. And what that means to me, how I read that is, you don't follow what I say. You don't follow what Gandhi says, or Moses, or Jesus, or Muhammad. Pick your guru, the Buddha. You find your own way into it. Your own way might be through meditation. Your own way might be through, like mine, my journey is going through therapy. It might be through a recovery group. It might be in a silent retreat. It might be through yoga. It might be in working with children who are dealing with terminal illnesses, right? And the Make-A-Wish Foundation. It might be working with families who can't afford this kind of treatment. It might be becoming a therapist or learning to paint. And your journey has to be yours. And that's why we can be very humble with each other and to say, I don't know what will work with you. I can tell you what I found to work. I can tell you what worked for me, but it may not work for you. But if you seek what I sought, which is peace, right? Serenity, greater meaning, greater connection with everybody around me, especially those that I care about. If you truly seek those things, you'll find your way. You'll find your path. You'll find your pathway through the forest. But you don't have to do what I've done or what others have done. It's why I don't like therapists becoming very directive and rigid and absolute about what clients should and shouldn't do, especially parents who are already struggling with tremendous fear and anxiety and pain and sadness. Michael Meade said, becoming who we truly are requires the greatest amount of change. Do you start to hear it now? Becoming who we are requires the greatest amount of change. To do that, we have to unlearn virtually everything we've learned about ourselves and the world and choices and health and pathology and piety and evil and good. We have to cast off other people's ideas about the way the world works and find our own music. I said to my friend last night, I said, if you keep dancing to the song that you think you're supposed to be dancing to, or singing the song that you're supposed to be singing, instead of singing the one that's coming from your heart and your soul, you'll forever be stuck in mental illness and addiction. You'll need to medicate to keep that quieted down and keep that discomfort and discontent at bay. This is the gentle reminder, Xavier Dogba said, this is a gentle reminder that your triggers are not in the way. They are the way. Your symptoms, your child's struggles are not in the way. They are the way. Rumi said it when he said, the solution for the pain is in the pain. Carl Jung, and this is a quote that I could have taken from Carl Jung or from Joseph Campbell. If the path before you is clear, there's a typo here, sorry. If the path before you is clear, you're probably on somebody else's path. Like Campbell points out, the knights of King Arthur thought it most noble to go into the forest where there was no path. Because if there was a path, it was somebody else's path. We learn to venture out. The way that I've been able to leave the shore, if you will, you know that old saying, you can't discover new lands unless you're willing to let go of the side of the shore. The way that I've been able to do that, when I have been able to do it, and I haven't always been, and sometimes still can't let go of the shore, is by spending enough time with somebody like my therapist, Dr. Gill, who helps me find home, who makes that 1 hour a week for the past 23 years the place where I find myself, the sacred place that I go back to again and again to find myself. She makes that known to me over and over again. And so when I do venture out there and take a risk and tell my wife something difficult, make a different decision with my career, start to write a book, delete 3 pages out of my manuscript because it doesn't quite fit, whatever it is, big or small. I do those things because I'm carrying home with me. I'm carrying safety with me. I read an article yesterday from the Washington Post. I wrote about this on my social media, where they were talking about how if men could learn to be vulnerable, then they could improve their relationships, which is kind of very obvious. But what they didn't write about is there's 2 parts to being vulnerable. You have to find a safe context, a non-judgmental context, a non-anxious context, a non-controlling context, a non-triggered context, ideally, to practice becoming vulnerable. You have to find a sacred, safe place to rediscover yourself over and over again, to practice discovering yourself, to practice being connected to your authentic, your real self that was lost in childhood at the urging, unconscious urging of our parents to take care of them. You have to rediscover and reconnect, stay connected to that over and over again. The parts of yourself that you were taught were unacceptable, ugly, um, that were not okay. You have to be in relationship to those parts and help those parts to grow and reemerge, to find yourself, to live the life that is your life. Brendan Durrell, some of these people I don't know who they are, which actually goes all the better for this broadcast this evening. It doesn't matter. I've quoted Marilyn Manson. In my second book, I quoted Will Smith, the actor, before the slap. And when I've quoted people who've later on, or even before, done some really terrible things, I have a little bit of worry that people are going to be triggered by that. But then I remember that my teaching isn't based on the logical fallacy that because I say it, it's true, or because I say it, it's not true. The truth just sells itself. Doesn't matter where it comes from. So Brendan Durrell said, many don't understand that in order to be in intimacy with your higher self, you got to claim your lower self. I'm going to read that again. This is so simple, so seminal to what I'm talking about tonight. Many don't understand. He actually wrote understand. I don't know if that's a typo. That in order to be in intimacy with your higher self, you got to claim your lower self. It doesn't work to be a fraction of who you are. And to then present that to the world and get the adoration, the praise, the acknowledgement, the sense of belonging, if you haven't shown your whole self. If you haven't shown your whole self, it doesn't work or it doesn't matter. Rumi said, your mistakes can also lead to the truth. It's what I tell the kids in the wilderness. I say to them, I said, you've made mistakes, plenty, to earn your ticket to evoke. But then I remind them, I've made more mistakes than you. Just by virtue of the fact that I've been alive. And to be honest with you, I've spent a good deal of time making the same mistakes over and over again. But that's the only way to figure out who you are, is to bumble your way through it, to feel your way along. Speaking of this in therapy, this is from the Audacity to Be You. I wrote, Winnicott's idea of the false self may suggest that the false self brings the real self into therapy. That is to say that what therapy is in the beginning, a search for answers to what one should do, becomes something different in the end, a search for the real self. We enter therapy to deal with a struggling child or difficulties in marriage, and if we stay with it long enough, we come to realize that the real question is a question about self. As we change our course to finding our center, we realize that all relationships are affected by this cornerstone notion of self. As it is with enlightenment, the discovery of self is a destructive process when we unlearn and cast off those ideas and influences that prevent us from knowing. I think this is my last slide before the take home tonight. I just love this quote. I don't know who said it. I screenshotted it from my social media, but it goes like this. Marriage is hard. Divorce is hard. Choose your hard. Obesity is hard. Being fit is hard. Choose your hard. Being in debt is hard. Being financially disciplined is hard. Choose your hard. Communication is hard. Not communicating is hard. Choose your hard. Life will never be easy. It will always be hard, but we can choose our hard. Pick wisely. Right? That's the same thing when I say you don't get to win, you get to be yourself. You don't get to be right anymore. You get to be yourself. So, what are the take home? That we have to change our relationships around the ideas of loyalty. That sometimes we outgrow old friends and old family members who at one time were really important to us and were there for a critical important part. It's not because we don't love them or we're angry or we want to be cruel to them, but sometimes we have to move on. We have to change our ideas about what intimacy is. And we have to learn the idea that intimacy is predicated on each individual's ability to be alone with themselves, to be at home with themselves. And that is the number one predictor of whether people are going to have deep intimacy. We have to change our ideas about child rearing. In the book, The Audacity, before I talk about the 3 keys to enlightenment, I talk about 13 myths, most of which are about parenting, either as ourselves as the children or ourselves as the parent. My therapist has said many times to me that raising her son, who now is a very successful attorney living in Washington, D.C., raising her son, she was constantly getting feedback from the community and the people around her that she was doing it wrong. We have to change our relationship to mistakes, to setbacks. I said for many years that I spend more time helping parents learn to value mistakes that they and their parents make than almost any other thing. It's akin to the growth mindset that Carol Dweck pioneered. The idea that we can learn from our mistakes instead of abhor them or be ashamed about them with the right kind of support and the right kind of work. We have to change our relationship with good and bad and right and wrong. And there is a grief each time we let go of these thoughts, these ideas, these relationships. Each time the season turns from summer to fall to winter, as it leads into spring and new life. Each time we do this, there is a grief. And sometimes it can't be explained to the person that you're leaving behind. Because if you could explain it to them, you wouldn't need to leave them. You wouldn't need to move on. We have to change our idea about selfishness. Selfishness is a word that was used in our childhood to teach us about what we shouldn't do. And sometimes things that the greatest thing that we have to overcome in our self-care is the feeling, the idea of selfishness that comes to us when we do it. To let others down, to take care of ourselves first, to secure our own mask, right? The first time I saw that secure your own mask analogy or speech on an airplane, it made perfect sense to me. And yet, like you, my first instinct with my child would be to put it on them first. It's probably one of the most commonly used analogies in parenting. The unlived life, Jung explained, is the greatest burden for a child to bear. If you don't become the source of your happiness, if the child is the ultimate source of your happiness and unhappiness, what a fantastic, wonderful, horrible burden to lay on their shoulders. Conversely, if you do the work of individuation, of becoming who you are, and develop a sense of home wherever you are, you can be available to your children, to your spouse, to the people that you work around and work for and work with and work for you in much more profound ways. We have to change the relationship to our past. One of the things I say often is that for therapy to be most effective, the client has to come with at least the idea, believing in the option that there are some unconscious things contributing to their life. We just had a full moon a couple of nights ago, and people who want to associate moods or feelings or behaviors to a full moon, you can have your belief system, but I want to say to them, there's actually a better way to find out what's driving you. You don't have to project it out onto the moon or to the stars. You can actually do the work of going inward and discovering why you might be feeling an itch, an anger, a frustration, a discontent, or even a joy. We have to change our idea about our parents, about our childhood. As Alice Miller says, it's the one enduring weapon in our fight against mental illness, the discovery, the unraveling, the uncovering of our childhood, our emotional experiences in childhood. Sometimes it goes to the essence of our ideas about metaphysics, about what is. We have to change our ideas about God, about spirituality, about religion. We have to grow up and become adults. And in most cases, we had no model. The reason why we have such difficult times developing relationships because we had no model for them. I was just telling my 14-year-old the other day. We were talking about some of the publicity that's going on in the treatment program today. There was just an article in the New York Times about it today, and she was asking me about it. And I was giving examples of things that I would do or my staff would do 20 years ago. And she said incredulously, "Why would you do that?" And I said very quietly and simply, I said, "The thing is, I didn't know the difference between unhealthy behavior and love back then." And I paused and I said, "Sometimes I still don't know the difference." That's why I love Pink Floyd's song "Wish You Were Here" when they write, "Do you think you can tell heaven from hell? Blue skies from pain? Can you tell a green field from a cold steel rain?" What they're saying is, it's not as clear to us as we think. We can be more humble, more of a student to this life, and be open to new ideas. And what I can tell you is on the other side of it is joy, right? On the other side of it is freedom, happiness. If you are falling, Joseph Campbell said, dive. All right, I'll go over the upcoming and then I'll take any live questions. My book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and the Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon and Audible. I was the narrator for the second book, The Audacity to Be You. I have an upcoming second edition of the Conscious Parenting Workshop is on December 2nd. I think there's just a few spots left. So we filled up November 4th. We are about to close December 2nd. If you're interested in coming to that, it's December 2nd is the one that has some openings, 9:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. That'll be a group discussion, a group days of activities, interactive. We have, if you want to do a deep dive in your own work, in my opinion, the best thing you can do for yourself, Finding You workshop, November 9th through 10th, I believe has one spot available left. And then it'll be into December 7th through 11th. We also have an online version if you want to save some money, if your schedule doesn't permit going away for 5 or 6 days. November 11th through 13th is the online Finding You workshop. To register or for more information, contact intensives@evoketherapy.com. We have support groups for current and alumni wilderness families. October 13th, that's in a couple of days at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time, is our next offering. And for our alumni, we have one a month meeting just for alumni families, October 25th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. Once a month, we have an intensives support group. November 8th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time is the next offering. Contact Malia@evoketherapy.com for more information. At Evoke, we have therapists that are trained in the attachment-based model, which is the model that I base my work and Evoke base its work on. So if you would like a coach to do virtual coaching for you, couples coaching, individual coaching, family coaching, parent coaching, contact coaching@evoketherapy.com and sign up there. We have pursuit trips for adventure trips for families and young adults all over the world. Think therapy light or sober fun. We ask all current parents to attend, to try, to experiment with 6 12-step support groups. Any combination of Al-Anon.org, CODA.org, FamiliesAnonymous.org, or AdultChildren.org. These are free. These are teaching the same kinds of principles that I'm talking about. Also, you can go to refugerecovery.org or NAMI.org, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. All of these programs offer free resources, classes even online in your community. So it takes away virtually all the excuses that we have. If you would like to listen to these broadcasts on the podcast, they're available on Spotify and your favorite podcast app. Just search Finding You and Evoke Therapy Podcast, or go to soundcloud.com on your computer, or you can go to Evoke's YouTube channel and you can watch them there with the slides and the quotes in the video there. On Evoke, at Evoke and myself, Brad Reedy, we have accounts on Twitter and Instagram. Just search at Evoke Therapy and at Dr. Brad Reedy on those respective platforms. Also, we have an intensive account on Instagram. Just go to at Evoke Therapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. You can also go to the blog, which Malia curates each week. If you want to give back to folks that can't afford therapy, you can donate to our partners, choosementalhealth.org, sky'sthelimitfund.org, or the evokefamilyfoundation.org. Also, I'd just like to share something near and dear to my heart. The Evoke Family Foundation earmarked a fund within their foundation in loving memory of my dear friend Peter Brown, who passed away a few weeks ago. This will be for those families who have a young person who identifies as LGBTQ. So if you're interested in donating, if you're interested in earmarking that for somebody that identifies in the LGBTQ plus community, you can donate to the Peter Brown Fund. You can go to Evoke to find out more about it, or you can you scan the QR code here on the video. My next broadcast will be next Thursday, October 20th. I'll do a live Q&A. Any leftover questions from tonight, any new questions, you can always email us at webinar@evoketherapy.com with questions, suggestions, feedback, principles, things you'd like me to talk about. We're happy to take those up when we can. All right, it looks like somebody tells me, "Hi Brad, we had Harriet Lerner discuss the dance of anger at our meditation group, and I really liked your webinar on the subject. Thank you for that. I appreciate it." All right, folks, that looks like the only question we have for today. I'll see you next Thursday, the 20th. Send in questions in advance or attend live. You can also invite your family and friends to attend if you want to give them a taste of what these live broadcasts are like. Have a great week, folks. Take care, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.